I'm very interested in the idea. So obviously, you're quite knowledgeable on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is built on Stoic principles, and I'm very interested in how today, sort of how we're bringing up the younger generation and the newer generation. Of course, all throughout
Yeah.
history, there's no shortage of the older generation, saying the younger
Yeah.
generation is garbage. It's sort of an archetype for a reason, but it's interesting to me because we do seem to be bringing up children with the idea that are sort of against Stoic principles, and certainly against cognitive behavioral therapy, such as like, okay, well, you have to, don't focus on what you can change. Don't, we'll change the system around you. We'll make grading easier. We'll make tests easier. We'll give you retests in school. We'll give everyone a participation trophy, as opposed to, you changing your behavior and making yourself better, you taking control over your own life. And I just want to mention quickly that I'm reading this book now, Setting the Bar by Shane Trotter, and he's a teacher in the U.S.
Aye.
And he makes the case that he says it directly, that it does seem to be that we're bringing up kids in the education system that is opposed to cognitive behavioral therapy principles. What are your thoughts on that, as someone who, and I know you're a father as well, and I know you're obviously concerned with mentoring and all that stuff. How do you think about that or see it?
I haven't read the book that you're talking about, but this is a well-trodden politicized debate, I would say, that it's kind of, always been a bit of a battle between conservatives and progressives,
Yeah.
to some extent, like it kind of falls along those lines. I'm going to surprise you by saying I think they're all wrong, which is usually
Mm.
the case anyway, right? I think
Yeah,
they're all
to some
wrong, and
extent,
that
for
because
sure.
maybe I'm simplifying the debate, but this is kind of I think it's useful to present it in these terms, and maybe it's a little bit more nuanced than this. But basically, it seems to me that often there are kind of progressives or people on the left that say, look, there are things in society that upset people. So what we should do is change society and eliminate those upsetting things to protect people's, so they don't get their fuels hurt or whatever, And then, so don't worry, I'm gonna ridicule both sides, for balance, for equal balance here, right? And then you've
Yeah.
got people on the right that are like, well, when I was young, we used to just throw kids out and they had to fend for themselves, and then, like we'd let them play in building sites and stuff like that. And then, we should just let people be exposed to upsetting and painful and distressing things, and it'll toughen them up. It's tough love. It'll be good for them in the long run or whatever. And that's also stupid. And they're both wrong. Now, the one thing I'd say about CBT, and I don't know, I emphasize that I'm not talking about the book you mentioned because I haven't read it. But what I'll see all over the internet are people who don't know anything about CBT using CBT to try to support the kind of more right wing conservative view, which is that we should just kind of expose people to stuff that's upsetting, and they need to learn to toughen up or whatever. And their claim
Mm.
is that what they call CBT, and actually really it's a form of behaviour therapy called
Yeah.
exposure therapy. By exposing, CBT shows that by exposing ourselves and facing our fears, we desensitize to them, and that's the way to go with children, right? And so, like most terrible arguments, that's a half truth, which ends up, being turned into a falsehood. So in exposure therapy, which is a subject I could happily talk about, we know a huge amount about it. There's more research on this than just about any other psychology, and we've been known about it for well over half a century, right? So it's bread and butter part of CBT. I specialise in anxiety treatment, so particularly part of that type of therapy. All right, so let me tell you how that works in a nutshell. Yes, like emotional habituation, as we call it, takes place. So if people face their fears patiently, repeatedly, for a prolonged period, i.e. for longer than normal, considerably longer than normal, and they are not doing certain specific things that would be counterproductive, that we call safety-seeking behaviours or subtle avoidance or whatever. So basically, if you do it in a repeated, controlled way for a prolonged period, 90% or more of the time, the anxiety in particular, and to some extent some other unpleasant feelings, will abate naturally. And I think that is one of the things that school kids should learn, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
However, like in society, it's usually not under a control. Like exposure normally doesn't take place under controlled conditions, and normally it's not, funnily enough, for a prolonged enough period of time for habituation to take place. What I saw someone, I'll give you an example of a specific bad argument, right? I saw somebody talking about trigger warnings for, like, say, in a university lecture, showing a video about, like, that touched on the subject of rape. As I say, there may be somebody in the audience, like, who's been a victim of sexual assault, and so, you know, you might want to notify them beforehand that, and this is a problematic question, it's a nuanced question, like, you might want to give them a heads up that you're going to be turning the lights down and showing a documentary about, you know, like, people being raped in Africa or somewhere like that, right? And so I've seen people say, yeah, but we should be, like, encouraging people to expose themselves to these things so they toughen up. That would be a terrible example, right? Because it's not under controlled conditions. Because the exposure would be maybe like 30 seconds or something, it wouldn't be anywhere near long enough for emotional habituation to actually occur, right? So that's a joke. That explanation doesn't apply. And what we know is that in some cases where exposure is uncontrolled, someone's not prepared for it, and particularly if it's not long enough, it can actually sensitize them even more. Or sometimes that's called re-traumatizing somebody, right? So you might actually make them worse, right? So don't try and use psychotherapy, like, you know, to justify, which these guys don't know anything about, like, is a bogus argument to try and justify just kind of like throwing people in, expecting them to be exposed and not to be a problem. That's not how that's not how psychology works, right? But what I could say, now having kind of slagged off both sides of the argument and satirized them a little bit, there's a kind of grain of truth, right? And do you know who gets this right? The Stoics, right? Epictetus, and this is a part of Epictetus that no one ever mentions, and I think it's absolutely fundamental to understanding Stoicism, right? So Epictetus repeatedly tells his students, they present the same dilemma to him. What's the dilemma? The dilemma is, should you face problems or situations that you find distressing, or should you avoid them, right? This is what this debate essentially revolves around. So one side say you should avoid them or you should remove them because we don't want to upset people unnecessarily, and the other side say no, you should expose yourself to them because then you'll toughen up, right? Well, they're both half right, so they're both wrong in essence, right? What Epictetus says is that you need to know yourself and study yourself, learn your limitations, and then make a judgment call about whether exposing yourself to a difficult situation in life would be overwhelming or whether you'd be able to endure it. So the truth is kind of somewhere in the middle, right? And the analogy that the Stoics use is wrestling. So to expand on what the analogy that they imply, it would be like saying, should you, like, if you're a wrestler or a boxer or something, a martial artist, whatever, like, should you only fight people that you can beat really easily and avoid fighting anybody that's difficult? Well, no, because you're never going to get any better that way, right? You need to push yourself, and you need to spar against people like that are more of a challenge. Okay, should you fight some guy that's twice your size and is just going to pummel you into the ground each time, like, and massively outclasses you? Like, well, maybe not, because it's going to be demoralizing and stuff, and maybe you're not going to learn that much from that experience. So your ideal sparring partner, and you imagine an ancient Greek, like, gymnasia, palestra, they match people up, right? So they're going to go, this guy's about your level, or this guy's like a little bit better than you. Like, so these are the guys that you want to wrestle and fight against, and, you'll progressively get better. So not too easy and not too difficult, but somewhere in the middle. That's going to be and who's going to be the right balance is going to be different for each competitor, right? For each wrestler, right? And nobody's going to be able to make a general rule. Like, they're going to say you're going to need your coach, like, or you yourself, to judge who's the best guy for you to spar next, right? And the idea that you should just fight everybody, like, is maybe not realistic. It's not going to be helpful. Or the idea that you should just avoid fighting anybody that's difficult is probably a bad idea as well. You're going to have to use your brain. Like, study yourself and your own performance, and then figure out what would be pushing yourself but not overwhelming yourself. And Epictetus is pretty clear about that, because it seems like common sense to him. But we don't have common sense anymore. in our society, particularly among experts and journalists and people that write books like me. So the easiest way to make a big noise on the internet is just to go to one wild extreme or the other. And that obviously that's usually that's how stupidity works in general, is like blunt dichotomous thinking. So it's either black or white. No, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and it kind of varies a bit from one person to another. And that's what life is all about, is kind of having to figure out, what's an appropriate amount of exposure to overcome. But a little tip that I would give is it's hard for people to understand that the duration of exposure is important, because when we expose ourselves to unpleasant situations, we naturally feel a tendency to escape the situation, to use the technical term, to leave. So if you have someone who's got cat phobia and you throw them in a room full of cats, the one thing that's pretty universal is they're going to have an overwhelming urge to open the door and run out the room, right? So they're going to have a drive to escape the situation. And, so people need usually someone else present, normally a parent or a coach or a psychotherapist, to say, even though you desperately want to leave this room, I think it would be a good idea if you just kind of wait it out a little bit longer until your heart rate slows down, your anxiety will start to abate naturally. So it usually seems to be the presence of another person that encourages somebody to get past that initial hump. But in normal society, when you don't have someone supporting you like that, that's not how things work. And just kind of throwing people into situations where traumatic things occur is not going to make them tougher. In many cases, it not in every case, but in many cases, it's unpredictable. But in a significant number of cases, it can backfire and have the opposite effect. So that's not a good strategy. I think the debate is kind of a little bit more nuanced. And actually, another thing I'd say about that is, my specialism as a therapist is social anxiety, and so. Broadly speaking, clinical trials show that exposure therapy for somebody who has a animal phobia, like a snake phobia, a spider phobia or whatever, has roughly a 90% success rate, right? It's very simple. It's a physiological, almost more than what we would think of as a kind of high level emotional process. It's pretty visceral. Your heart rate slows down following a kind of curve. That works even in animals, even in very primitive animals. This habituation process occurs. But social anxiety, the success rate is about 75%. It's high, but it's not as high. Yeah. Why would that be? Well, because people with social anxiety are not scared of other people's faces, right? What they're scared of is what other people might be thinking about them. And it's hard to construct a situation in practice where you expose someone to what other people might be thinking of them. It's called fear of negative evaluation, in a prolonged and repeated manner, in an appropriately controlled way. So, normally in social situations, you kind of get little flickers of anxiety that kind of wax and wane and come and go. So exposure often isn't prolonged enough for the habituation to occur. Whereas if you've got spider phobia, you just set a spider in front of you and look at it for as long as you like until you get bored, right? But it's hard to expose yourself to the idea that other people are judging you negatively consistently for a long period of time. And that's one of the main reasons I think why the success rate is a little bit lower. So in other complex social situations, exposure is often fleeting. It's often too fleeting or too ambiguous for people to benefit from it in the way that those authors that cite CBT would like to assume. But the bottom line is, here's a clue: when someone's using a piece of science to support their argument, if it looks like they probably have never read any books on the subject and don't know anything about it, you probably want to dig a little bit deeper as to whether the science that they're citing actually supports the things that they're saying. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting though with children particularly, because sort of And you could say that's the role of the parents, but also society as a whole, and teachers play a massive role in this. That's why this particular gentleman's so concerned. But because obviously, like, you're absolutely right. When you come into the world, you're a baby. You can't exactly throw them to the wolves and say, okay, fight for yourself. You'll be tougher from it, right? That would just be ridiculous. At the same time, sort of you want to progress them as a parent. You want to progress them to the point where when they leave home, they are more or less a self-sufficient adult, right? And so it takes a lot of I guess awareness, both of yourself, but also of your child's limitations, to be able to put them on that perfect path and challenge them in the right way. I do think, though, generally speaking, I see quite a bit people not wanting to challenge their kids at all. Like, I'll give you a great example. Like, when I was a kid, I was like, pretty much, I was told to be courageous as hell, right? Like, go for it. I'm not going to let you drown, but go for it. And then I was watching this kid when I was probably 17. I was watching the neighbor's kid, and he was trying to swim with his life jacket on, right? And so the kid wanted, and he was like 5 or 6 and really shallow water. There were adults there, and he wanted to take his life jacket off. And the parents said, no, you can't take the life jacket off. You gotta be safe. And I remember thinking that, like, okay, if that were my dad, he'd probably rip the life jacket off, and obviously he wouldn't walk up to the house and get drunk, but he would stay there and make sure I'm safe, but he would allow me to sort of have that act of courage so that I could grow from it. And I feel like, and that was years ago now, and I feel like it seems to be getting maybe a little bit worse, where we're trying to take away the challenge of things. And again, you're right, it's very hard to know that balance. And maybe that's where some of it is, because it's like a laziness. Like, how do we find that perfect balance, right?
Yeah, it's laziness. It's like, because people want to go to one extreme or the other. And the hard part is it takes time and effort to pause and think, in this particular situation, is it actually beneficial to do this or not?